There's a few famous off-meta builds that float around, especially for the Assassin, one of which that has been coming up oddly frequently lately, and that's the Whirlwind Assassin, sometimes called the Chaos Assassin or Spider Assassin, but in today's case we're looking at a sub-build of that which has cropped up in a handful of very specific requests, the Whirlwind Blade Shield Venom Assassin. Obviously, since this is a niche of an equipment-based build, there's really not much that can be gone into whenever it comes to leveling a character for this, since unless you have a Chaos Claw, there's really no way you're actually going to end up using this build, and that is an endgame piece of gear. The closest we could get would possibly be a Venom Bow Assassin or maybe a subset of the Bladeson build itself, both of which I want to save for more in-depth videos in the future. So today's going to be a bit different. Instead of doing more of a build review and looking at the pros and cons of the build, as well as some of its closest competitors. Starting with the build requested and mentioned, the Venom and Blade Shield variant. It does bring in some rather useful traits, since Blade Shield is an area of effect skill, albeit a fairly short range one, that ticks along in a radius around your character as you go, and Whirlwind serves as a solid skill for sliding through groups of enemies with a series of rapid-fire attacks to go with it. This means you're delivering Venom quite regularly, and it's a good way to deliver it and the area of effect Venom as well. The most common request is showing this off with the newly implemented version of the Plague Runeword, and going for maximum poison damage rather than the usual strategy of Whirlwind Assassins, where they go for damage, deadly strike, and crushing blow effects just to deal a wave of damage with the spins themselves. And both are about as effective as each other, but in different ways, and with somewhat different skill point setups. For the poison flavor of this build, since there really isn't a template or guide for it beyond the requests, I went balls to the walls with focusing on Venom. This means making sure we have our Plague sitting out there for us to use, thanks to its minus poison resistance and of course the lower resistance when struck effect. Not to mention, it's helped along by a number of great modifiers like plus skills, deadly strike, bleed, etc., even a bit of a cleansing aura. And the skills I have on this one that I decided to use just for this build are a little superfluous, but they're handy nonetheless. And of course our other weapon is Chaos, which is how we do the Whirlwind. Normally Chaos is paired with a Fool's Claw or Fury if you need something consistent, but I chose to use this one since it gives me Dragonflight, and while it also has Death Sentry and stuff like that, I decided not to use it for this run since it didn't really fit the theme people were pushing for. The other pieces of gear due to the Venom focus are going to be Bramble Armor for obvious +% poison damage, and while the Thorns is not bad, it's otherwise just an okay piece of armor with some poison resist to make up for the fact that we will be using a Sunder Charm. Combine that with Trangul's Claws for even more poison damage and some resist, and that's about as much as we will be able to pump it unless we want to start dipping into poison facets, which I opted not to burn for this build, but they are an option that can make it significantly stronger. The rest of our gear is plus skills or looking to redeem a bit of extra damage for our Whirlwind side. That means Gore Riders for crushing blow and more deadly strike, as well as Raven Frost to keep our attack speed up even when dealing with cold enchanted enemies, slapping a bit of leech into our other ring slot to keep us topped off while moving through the storms of enemies as we fight, and then moving into our plus skills and attack speed with the rest of our stuff. With Arachnid's Mesh being the current pick for the belt, since it boosts the base level of Venom with the plus all skills, which gives our percent boost more to work with, and then up into the Amulet and Helmet, there's some things to consider. In the current case, I have Andariel's for plus poison resist, attack speed, and plus skills. And I'm actually using an older one of mine with an enhanced damage jewel of Fervor in it. Just gives us enough attack speed to hit the fastest possible Whirlwind speed. If you don't have access to this, remember that you'll need 19% increased attack speed off weapon to hit with it and our weapon choices here, due to the base speed of Feral Claws. There are faster ones that can reduce this need further, but this is what I had that felt good. The Amulet is probably going to be our first place to ideally get that attack speed if you cannot get it from the helmet, since High Lords is a solid pick here, but since we already had the attack speed, I went ahead and went with Mara's to help with our resist a bit, since even though we have Fade, resists are going to be something this setup struggles with due to the focus on poison damage. A couple of important notes about the equipment on a Whirlwind Assassin: even if you don't have expensive claws like this, repairing is going to be a pain in the ass. Not because of price. If you use basic Feral Claws, they're not terrible unless you're using certain specific rune words or items, but because of how frequently you have to repair them. Only way I went with these was because I still habitually pick up all the Ort runes I see and use those for repairs on expensive items when I'm not being lazy. And since we are restricted to claws, our Blade Shield will only do so much work since we can't punch it up as high as we can with other weapon choices more common on the Bladeson. I should also probably note that we're not triggering most of our chance to cast stuff with this build, since neither Whirlwind or Blade Shield trigger on striking effects, so don't be expecting frozen orbs and such to come flying out while you're spinning to wind. So in general, we're relying on the fast applying poison and area of effect of Blade Shield to compensate for our lower overall damage per hit, and surprisingly, it works, at least with a Poison Sunder charm, and using Shadow Charms to boost our Venom damage and our Claw Mastery to squeeze out a little more punch. That said, the skills for this will seem a bit weird, but I was trying to balance hit chance since it does kind of affect the blade skills with the desire to focus on Venom, and well, of course, getting the blade skills up and running. So while the level 20 Venom is pretty straightforward and expected, I also went with level 20 Claw Mastery and 1 point in Weapon Block because we are dual claw, so it'd be stupid not to use it, and we need that Weapon Mastery to actually, hit. Over in the Trap Tree, I decided to go hard into Blade Shield, Blade Fury, and then put any spare points I had into Blade Sentinel to keep the damage pushing up at least as much as possible on Blade Shield. And in a pinch, we could use Blade Fury to hit from a range, but it never really came up in my test runs as something that's necessary since we can Dragonflight over to ranged enemies. Speaking of Dragonflight though, in the martial arts tree, I actually invested 0 points, but that's thanks to the weapon provided Dragonflight on my gear. If you didn't have this on a claw, you'd need to spend 4 points getting 1 in each of the finishing moves, since Dragonflight is really helpful for crowd jumping, especially against ranged opponents. Overall, this setup was sufficient for beating the game. It did well against bosses, worked its way through normal enemies rather reliably, though having to repair my weapons after every cow level clear because they'd hit orange by the end was a bit frustrating. And this is mostly because your main weapon is being drained not only by Whirlwind, which evenly spreads degradation between the two, but also because Blade Shield actually will damage your main hand weapon as well, so you will be churning through even the durability on a decent durability claw. Now, how does it compare to its competitors? It actually does fairly well outside of the repair issues, which honestly are still a problem for the Whirlwind Assassin itself. It's just the Blade Shield amplifies it for one of your weapons. I think the main advantage of this for me that made it just feel better than the standard Chaos build is how the area of effect was constantly basically tapping everything as I moved through the crowds, meaning I wasn't relying on the Whirlwind to choose the right targets since I was, hitting everything. And the Venom aspect of this worked out fairly well too, and while you don't see the poison clouds because I opted for a decent amount of chill to go alongside Plague's Freeze, the damage it adds when ticking out did help out with the crowd control as well, making it feel a bit better and smoother than just the raw whirling dervish. And since I can use a Poison Sunder to bypass enemy resists, I don't have to worry about physical immunes or the increased risk of using a physical Sunder. Now, that said, I think there are builds that do different aspects of this better. One big example being the Blade Sin, since it's far less equipment reliant, but gets extremely painful when stacked up with endgame gear, and can even use the Venom and Blade Shield trick if it wants to, but compare it with a higher damage indestructible weapon if you go far enough in. Now, an alternative to the Poison Whirlwind that might work out better is the physically focused one, but I'd need to find an extremely GG rare claw to test it, that frankly would be a nightmare to even trade for, much less find yourself, and that would be a rare feral claw with Fools, increased attack speed, and either auto repair or indestructibility, and go hardcore into physical damage with fortitude and such. This would do more with Blade Shield, but would also have the weakness of needing to rely on a physical Sunder instead, and lacking damage diversity, even with 20 points in Venom. But overall, I enjoyed doing a deviation from a popular build, and if you have all the expensive gear, it can be fun and effective on at least lower player counts, though I wouldn't really bother without that high-end gear. And if you're curious, there are about a half dozen different flavors of this kind of build on YouTube just based on the vanilla Whirlwind Assassin with different tweaks, ranging from the Spider Sin that leads into traps and barely any bumps directly to the spin, all the way to brute force builds like we mentioned with Fortitude, G-Face, pure physical assassins we all know and love as the cliche off-meta build. So, do you think the constant repairing is worth the Blade Shield on the Whirlwind Assassin, or do you think it would bother you a little bit too much? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and regular viewers that make this kind of content possible.